All right, we've got a great night on graphing trigonometric functions. So to me, there's two big words you have to understand in order to graph. The first one is period. How long it takes to complete one cycle. I cannot stress this enough. If you don't understand that, then you're pretty much not going to understand how to graph any trig function. The period is the most important. How long it takes to complete one cycle. Amplitude is the height from the midline, and let's make a note that this is always positive. All right, so let's start with our basic trig functions. We'll start with y equals sine x. Okay, it's also read the sine of x. So the first thing we want to identify is the amplitude. Remember, your amplitude is the height. I'm going to underline it here. It is the number in front of sine. In this case, we don't see one, but in front of every term there is a 1. So our amplitude is 1. Our frequency is the number in front of x. So again, I'm going to put a little blue line there. The number in front of x, although you don't see one, there is 1 there. Okay, the period, the most important one, is how long it takes to complete one cycle. The formula is 2 pi over f. So in this case, it's 2 pi over 1, which is just 2 pi. And that is key. That is how long it takes to complete a cycle. The midline is the number that I would add or subtract at the end. Notice there is none, so I'm going to put none. It's basically, in this case, y equals 0, because there really isn't one. And then the min and max is going to be your midline. So let's make a little note. Midline minus the amplitude, and the midline plus the amplitude. So in this case, my midline is 0. 0 plus 1 will get me a positive 1, and 0 minus 1 would get me a negative 1. Okay, so now I can't, again, stress enough. I need to see 5 dots before you graph anything. If these 5 dots aren't perfect, we cannot give you credit. Okay, so let me say it again. I need to see 5 dots. So sine starts at 0, and it ends at 0, and smack in the middle it hits 0. Now it's ending at the period, which is 2 pi. So it's going to end at 2 pi. Smack in the middle of sine, it's going to hit 0, so that would make that at pi. In between, I'm going to have my max and my min. My max is 1, and my min is negative 1. Once you have these 5 dots, you are now free to graph a proper sine function. Now, the concavity is very important. From 0 to pi, we say this is concave down. It should look like a frown the entire way. It should look like it's frowning. Then from pi to 2 pi, it should be concave up, which should make a big smile. It needs to look exactly like that. Let's go ahead and attack cosine in a similar manner. Y equals the cosine of x. Okay, so again, in this case, my amplitude is 1. My frequency is also 1. My period is 2 pi over f, which in this case is just 2 pi, and again, that's the big one. My midline, I didn't add or subtract anything, so that's y equals 0. So then this is 0 minus the amplitude, so negative 1 for my min, and 0 plus the amplitude, positive 1 for my max. So again, I have to have 5 points before I graph. So cosine starts at its max, which in this case we said is 1. It also ends at its max, and our end data is at 2 pi. Smack in the middle, it's at its min, so that's at negative 1 at pi. And then right in between is where it hits its roots, its zeros. And again, 5 perfectly placed dots before you connect. Now, this should look down, concave down, down like a frown, up like it's smiling, and then concave down again. All right, so let's tackle some simple questions. Write a cosine equation that has a period of pi and an amplitude of 3. So cosine is the key, so I know it's cos. They're giving me the period is pi, and the amplitude is 3. Okay, so now, in my equation, I don't actually use period, I use frequency. So I'm going to use my period formula, so 2 pi over f, and they're telling me that answer is pi. Okay, so now I'm just going to put this over 1, and I'm going to cross multiply and solve for my f. So 2 pi is equal to f times pi. Divide out that pi. So my frequency is equal to 2. and my amplitude is 3, and that gives me enough information to go ahead and write this function out. So I'm going to say y equals, amplitude is, what did we say, 3. It's the cosine of, frequency is 2, x. Now this is just one example. I could put a vertical shift on the end, a phase shift. It didn't ask for that, so I'm not going to, but this is one perfect example of a cosine function with an amplitude of 3 and a period of pi. All right, now we have to go the other way and be able to write an equation that's already graphed. So again, I'm going to identify all the key features. Amplitude, midline, max, min, period, and frequency. Okay, so I like to start with the midline, and the midline is the middle of the graph. So I'm going to use yellow and just highlight the middle of my graph. So in this case, my midline is at y equals 0. Okay, now from 0, I'll find my amplitude. How high and how low do I go from my midline? And they should be the exact same. Notice this goes up 3 and this goes down 3. So my amplitude is 3, which makes my max a height of 3 and my min a height of -3. And then I need my period. And again, this is the one you've got to understand. Period is how long it takes to complete one cycle. So I'm going to set my formula, 2 pi over f, equal to what I think the period is. When does this cycle end? So you'll notice I have a hump above and a hump below. So I would say the cycle ends at 4 pi. So I'm going to set this equal to 4 pi. And just like we did before, I'm going to put this over 1. I'm going to cross multiply and solve for f. So 4 pi f equals 2 pi. I'm going to divide out the 4 pi. Notice the pi's are going to cancel, and I'll get a frequency equals 2/4 or 1/2. So now I have enough information to put this equation together. I'm just going to slide it down a tad here and write it at the top. So y equals, my amplitude is 3. Now notice it goes up first, so that's going to be a positive 3. It starts at 0, which makes that a sine function. My frequency, we just said, is 1/2 x. And then I'm just going to say plus 0 because that's where my midline was. I'm really not shifting it up or down. Now, do you need the 0? Of course not. I'm just stressing that's where my midline would go, or my vertical shift. Okay, now here are the two big questions. We've seen a lot of this on the most recent exams. And they're saying graph the following function. So, I think the most important thing to do is to state the 6. And we just did that in the previous example. Before you attempt to put anything on paper, we're always going to say state the 6. So the first thing I'm going to look for is, again, I start with my midline. And if I look at this function, the midline is -3. And then my amplitude, if I look at that function, my amplitude, your gut might want to say -1.5, but remember it's always positive, so 1.5. That makes my max value. I'm going to say my max value is -3 plus 1.5, so that gets that to be a -1.5. And my min value is -3 minus 1.5, so -4.5. Then I need my frequency and my period. Frequency and period. Now, my frequency is given. It's the number in front of x. And some of you like to just grab the 1/3, but if you look in front of x, there is a 1/3 and a pi. They all go together. Now, you'll notice the pi isn't on the top or the bottom. It's right next to it, and some of us are still missing this. Basically, you can put that pi over 1, and if you want to rewrite it, it's really pi over 3. All right, so now I need to do a little math to get that period. 2 pi over 3. So I'm going to say this is simple. Keep, change division to multiplication, and flip that fraction, 3 over pi. And now I can say, okay, the pi's disappear, and the period is 6. Now, holy smokes, that makes a big difference. And the reason that's a difference is notice my period does not have a pi in it. That means you are not counting your tick marks by pi. The period is 6. So let's go ahead and make a nice sketch. What that's telling me is that I'm not going to see one cycle until I get to 6. Let me say that again. I'm not going to see a cycle until I get to 6. There's no pi's there. I'm counting out 6 blocks. And I'm going to space them every 2 apart. So I'm going to say that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That is when my first cycle will end. The other thing I'm going to do is get my midline in, and my midline is at -3, so I counted by 2's, -1, -2, -3. And I'm going to lightly draw that in for myself. Now I know I'm using black marker here, but I'm lightly drawing it in. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and think about what my min and max have to be. I have to get to 4.5, so there's -4 and -5. Now, like we said before, we are not graphing until we plot the 5 points. So, this is sine. Sine starts on its root, and it ends on its root, which is 6. And smack in the middle, it has to hit its root, which is 3. In between, it will be at its max or min. This negative here tells me that I'm going to go to my min first. So directly in between 1 and 3, or 0 and 3, so at 1.5, I have to be at my min, which is -4.5. And then directly between 3 and 6, I need to be at my max, which we said is -1.5. Now I can go ahead and connect my smooth curve. Concave up, like it's smiling, and then down like a frown. Now it didn't say how many to graph, so I'm going to just leave one cycle there. On our exam, it has been telling you how many to exactly graph. All right, now our next one is a little nastier. On the set of axes below, graph 2 cycles, so they want to see exactly 2, of the cosine curve. Amplitude is 3, period is 4 pi over 3, midline's 5, and now they're telling you you have to hit a certain point. So again, I want to state the 6. So let's start with the midline. The midline is y equals 5, and the amplitude is 3. So therefore, I should be able to get my max and my min. My midline is 5 plus an amplitude of 3 gets me a max of 8 and a min of 2. Now I need my frequency and my period. This time they gave me the period is 4 pi over 3, and I need to go get the frequency now. All right, so 2 pi over f equals 4 pi over 3. Cross multiply. 6 pi equals 4 pi f. Divide out the 4 pi, so the pi's will cancel. Oops. So I'm going to say f equals 6/4, which is really 3/2. Okay, so until I do that, I'm not even ready to draw out the axes. So, keeping this in mind, my midline is at 5. I'm going to go ahead and start my drawing. So I'm going to put my x-axis down a little because I know I have to get to 5 and 8. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, now I got to be smart on my scale. I'm going to see this first cycle end, and this is where it gets sneaky, at 4 pi over 3. So here's what I'm saying to myself. I notice the pi over 3, and there's 4 of them. So my first tick mark is not pi over 2. My first tick mark is going to be 1 pi over 3. My next tick mark, 2 pi over 3. Then 3 pi over 3. Then 4 pi over 3. And that's when the first cycle should end according to the directions. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's draw in the midline at y equals 5. Okay. It's cosine, so it's going to start at its max. So the max we said is at 8. It's going to end at its max. Now that's at 4 pi over 3. Smack in the middle, it should be at its min, which we said is 2. And then halfway in between each of those is when it should hit its root, which in this case is at 5. Okay, and now that I officially have 5 points, I can go ahead and correctly draw this in. So it starts concave down, concave up, and concave down. Now, it wanted 2 cycles, so I have to repeat this. So I'm going to go back and count on my axes. I had 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3. I bet you can guess the next one is 5 pi over 3, 6 pi over 3, 7 pi over 3, and 8 pi over 3. And then again, I'm going to go ahead and plot my 5 points. So it starts at 1, it started at 4 pi over 3 at 8, and it ends at 8 pi over 3. Smack in the middle, it should be at its min, and then halfway in between those is where it should hit its roots. Again, I have 5 perfectly plotted points, and now I can go ahead and connect smoothly. And it did say 2 cycles. You'll notice it said pass through the point 2 pi over 3, 2. I didn't even worry about that, and just because the nature of it, it did turn out to pass through that point just by graphing it out correctly. So graphing these functions certainly takes time, and we really want you to focus on writing out the 6 before you attempt to graph. We're going to get a lot of practice in class tomorrow, and I would look forward to any questions. Have a great night.